Many businesses across the country are facing new restrictions, even shutdowns, as we heard from Natasha, because of the pandemic. But what they're not seeing this time is any new government help for them or for their workers. And that has some businesses considering desperate measures to stay afloat. Here's CBC's Ashley Burke.
Chef Harriet Clooney's restaurant is already closed 2 days a week because of the pandemic. Now new restrictions mean new cuts.
It's just the worst feeling in the world.
Ontario recently slashed capacity at restaurants to 50%. Now Clooney's cutting staff hours just before the holidays, and new legislation won't help. The federal government's offering $300 a week to workers directly impacted by COVID-19, but only if there's a lockdown, not restrictions.
It's not right, and it's not helpful. It makes everything really precarious, and it doesn't put the government in a position that they want either, because then we're going to have to lay off a whole bunch of workers.
The new legislation also provides wage and rent subsidies to businesses, but again, only applies if there's a lockdown.
With the removal of those support programs, we expect that in the spring of 2022, we're going to see a hollowing out of the business community across Canada like we have just not seen before.
The NDP doesn't just want business support, it wants to bring back CERB.
We are clearly still wrestling with the pandemic. The time for income support is clearly not past.
But Chef Clooney says restaurants like hers need help and fast. If not, they're considering closing for the month of January.
It's the worst thing I ever want to do as an employer if we don't need to. But given the restrictions, given the variant and the level of alarm that needs to be raised, it may be the most prudent thing.
Prudent, but painful, she says. Meanwhile, the government says it's now looking at if it should adjust the new legislation so it's more flexible. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Ottawa.
You heard Dan Kelly from the Business Federation there in Ashley's report. Well, today, the CFIB and Restaurants Canada have issued a joint letter to all of the premiers seeking financial support. Our Chase team reached Dan Kelly in Toronto. I want to get right to it, Dan, and thank you for joining us. We're all trying to put a smile on through this, trying to make the best of things, cutting down our holiday plans, etc. But then you come in with this really bleak picture. What is that picture?
Oh gosh, it's so terrible for small and medium-sized firms right now. Look, even before Omicron was as a thing, only 36% of small businesses across Canada were back to normal levels of sales. I think people driving around think that, oh gee, it looks busy, streets are crowded, parking lots busy, so it must be back to normal. Behind the counter in small businesses, that's very much not the case. But now with Omicron worries, even in advance of the restrictions, consumers were staying home. They were abandoning some of the reservations that they had made, party plans, catering events. And now restrictions are in place, making this even worse. Unlike the first couple of rounds of COVID, this wave, these businesses are already desperately weakened. A strong wind could blow them over at this stage, and Omicron may just be that.
And is it because it's, perhaps a third time, fourth, sometime in some cases for some, small businesses? Is that what it is?
Yeah, look, the average small firm has inherited $170,000 in new COVID-related debt. It's debt they didn't have prior to the pandemic, but have taken on to try to keep their businesses alive. Now we're seeing a new set of restrictions in place, consumers staying home, and all of the support programs that governments had introduced are either closed or significantly scaled back. Just last week, the federal government passed the bill to change the wage and the rent subsidy.
Yep.
You now need a 50% ongoing loss to be able to qualify for a nickel of help from Ottawa. Well, most businesses, perhaps if they're in full lockdown, they might qualify, but those capacity restrictions that are being passed in most provinces, those firms are not going to qualify and get no help. And at some point, we as Canadians are going to have to make the choice. We either let businesses open and continue to serve their customers and make money, or we're going to have to continue to provide support to them until such time as all of the restrictions are lifted. We can't just live in this purgatory that we've been in for much longer.
Dan, you mentioned one word there, and that is debt. So I suppose it's always a question of which debt is worse. You're talking about small businesses having a huge debt.
Yeah.
Then if you bail them out and you give them money, and I'm not using bailout in a derogatory term, but if you help them, if you show support for businesses and you give them taxpayers' dollars, taxpayers end up in debt. People who are in their 20s and 30s end up carrying that debt for decades. How do you balance the ask with that picture?
It is brutal. These are terrible choices that we're having to make right now. I don't want to pass on any more debts to my 13-year-old son than I absolutely have to. But when you look back at why these restrictions are in place, if we were subsidizing businesses because they made bad decisions, because they were poor operators, I would say forget it, let the market figure that out. But the reason that we have to subsidize them and pay taxpayers' dollars is that businesses are being closed down, we're told, in order to protect society, not because the business has done anything wrong, but because society has required us to put in place restrictions. So in that respect, I do feel like governments do need to dig deep and provide the supports necessary to businesses. And that means changes to the wage subsidy, the rent subsidy, reopening the CBC loan program, and restoring provincial grants like we did. A few provinces have moved in that direction, Quebec, Nova Scotia, but most have not. We need that to happen today.
You fired off that letter to the premiers. When are you expecting an answer? It's holiday time. Try to get anybody on the line right now, right?
Well, look, it was good news. I spoke to the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, just last night and made my pitch to her. Mm-hmm. It's clear that the federal government is listening, but we need action, and we need action right away. Governments should not be announcing any restriction unless they have a check to go with it to the businesses that are going to be deeply affected.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I certainly hope the picture turns around for all of us, Dan, but you be well. You take care, okay?
Thanks so much.
Dan Kelly in Toronto. He's president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business.